close your eyes if you like, or simply let your gaze grow soft and unfocused, resting gently on whatever lies before you. There is nowhere you need to be right now. There is nothing you need to do. The day is finished, and whatever it carried, its noise, its demands, its small victories and little worries, all of it is slowly, gently drifting away, like leaves carried off by a quiet autumn stream. Tonight, we are going to take a very long, very peaceful journey together. We are going to travel back through time, not in any hurried way, not with any urgency, but slowly, quietly, the way the last light of evening fades from the sky. We are going to visit another century, another world, a time when the earth looked much as it does now, when the stars were the same stars and the sea was the same sea, but when the people who walked upon that earth lived very different lives from our own. We are going to follow one particular life, a life that began in a quiet place, on a small and beautiful island, surrounded by the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. A life that would carry one man from that small, peaceful island all the way across the wide face of Europe, across mountains and rivers and plains and cold northern seas, before returning at last to a kind of stillness, a kind of rest. The life we are going to follow tonight is the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. You may have heard that name before. You may have images already in your mind. A man in a tall hat, a hand tucked inside a coat, battles and crowns and grand declarations. And some of those images are not wrong exactly. But tonight we are not going to rush toward those famous moments. We are going to take our time. We are going to begin at the very beginning, in the very quietest place. And we are going to walk slowly, carefully, through each chapter of this long and remarkable life, pausing often to notice the small details, the color of the sky over a particular harbor, the smell of the sea air, the sound of a schoolboy's footsteps on a cold stone floor. Because every great life, no matter how full of grand events it eventually becomes, begins in exactly the same quiet way. It begins with a child. And so we begin. Part 1. The Island. Imagine the Mediterranean Sea as it would have looked in the summer of the year 1769. Imagine it as you might see it from above, that impossibly blue water, that particular shade of blue that seems somehow to have been mixed with a little gold, a little green, a little of the white light of the southern sun. The surface of the sea moves gently, endlessly, turning and folding in soft rhythms that have nothing to do with any human concern. Now move your gaze westward, across that blue expanse, until you find a long, green shape rising from the water. It is an island, a fairly large one by Mediterranean standards, with a rugged spine of mountains running down its center, like the backbone of some great sleeping creature. The mountains are not terribly tall, but they are steep and dramatic, their slopes covered in a thick, fragrant scrubland called the maquis, a tangle of myrtle and rosemary and lavender and wild herbs that fills the air with a scent unlike anything else in the world. When the breeze moves across those hillsides, it carries that scent out over the water for miles, and sailors approaching the island can smell it long before they can see the land itself. This island is called Corsica. In the year 1769, Corsica was not a very well-known place. It had been passed back and forth between various owners over the centuries. The Genoese had controlled it for a long while, and before them others, going back and back through history into the haze of ancient time. But in 1768, just 1 year before our story begins, the Republic of Genoa sold the island to the Kingdom of France. The Corsican people themselves had tried very hard to be independent. They had fought, briefly and bravely, for their own freedom. But in the end, the larger forces of the wider world had prevailed, as they so often do. So in the summer of 1769, Corsica was a new French territory, still adjusting to this change, still finding its way. The people of the island spoke their own language, lived according to their own customs, ate their own food, celebrated their own festivals. They were proud people, with a strong sense of family and clan, with a deep attachment to their rocky, fragrant, beautiful island home. In a town on the western coast of Corsica, a town called Ajaccio, there lived a family by the name of Bonaparte. Ajaccio was not a large town. It sat on a gentle bay, surrounded by low hills, with the deeper mountains visible in the distance behind it. The harbor was calm and protected, and the town itself had the quiet, unhurried character of a place that has existed for a long time, without feeling the need to change very quickly. The houses were pale and square, their stone walls thick against the summer heat. The streets were narrow and irregular, winding between buildings in the way that old Mediterranean streets do, shaped more by the natural contours of a land than by any planned design. The Bonaparte family was not wealthy, but they were respectable. They were what might be called minor nobility. They had a family name that carried a small amount of social standing, but not enough money to live grandly. Carlo Bonaparte, the father, was a lawyer and a man of some local ambition. He was charming and sociable, known for his good looks and his gift for navigating the complicated social world of small-town Corsican life. He was 22 years old in 1769, not yet fully settled into his adult life, still finding his way. His wife, Letizia, was 19. She was a remarkable woman, though the world would not fully understand this for many years. She was strong, deeply so, not in a loud or aggressive way, but with a quiet, steady strength that ran through everything she did. She had grown up in uncertain times, on an uncertain island, and she had learned early that the only reliable thing in life is your own character. She was frugal, organized, and deeply devoted to her family. She had a seriousness about her that never quite left her, even in happy times, as though she was always aware that happiness is a temporary thing and must be protected carefully. On the 15th of August, in the year 1769, Letizia Bonaparte gave birth to her second child. The baby was a boy, and they named him Napoleone, spelled in the Italian way, as was customary in Corsica at the time. He had been born with a good deal of energy by all accounts, healthy, vigorous, with a pair of very dark eyes that seemed, even in those first days, to be looking at everything with a particular intensity. It was a warm summer day, as most days in Corsica are in August, and the air in Ajaccio would have been filled with the usual sounds and smells of the town. The distant murmur of the sea, the scent of salt and herbs, the voices of neighbors passing in the street below. Letizia had, by one account, barely made it home in time for the birth. She had been at a church service that morning, and the baby had come early and fast, arriving before the midwife could fully prepare. There is a small story, told and retold, growing into a kind of legend, that little Napoleone was born on a carpet that bore a depiction of ancient heroes. Whether or not this story is true in its details, it was certainly the kind of story that people would later want to tell about him. Let us stay for a while in this small stone house in Ajaccio, in those early years of Napoleone's childhood. Let us try to imagine the texture of daily life in that place and time. The Bonaparte household was a busy one. Children arrived regularly over the years. There would eventually be 8 Bonaparte children who survived infancy, which was itself a considerable achievement in an era when childhood illness could claim young lives with heartbreaking frequency. Napoleone grew up surrounded by brothers and sisters, by the particular energy and noise and warmth of a large family living together in a limited space. His oldest brother, Joseph, was just over a year older than he was, and the two boys were close from the beginning, though not always without friction, as brothers rarely are. Joseph was a gentler soul, more placid and sociable, inclined toward peace and comfort. Napoleone was different. Even as a small child, he was intense, competitive, always pressing forward, always wanting to be first. He had a temper that could flare quickly, though it could also subside just as quickly. He was not a cruel child, but he was an energetic and determined one. The streets of Ajaccio were his playground. He would run through those narrow lanes with the other children of the town, climbing the low walls of gardens, exploring the rocky headlands above the harbor, playing the kinds of games that boys have always played, games of chase and contest and imaginary adventure. The sea was always near. You could always hear it, always smell it. On hot afternoons, the harbor lay still and glittering in the sunlight, and the fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings. Letizia watched over all of this with her careful, knowing eyes. She was a firm mother, not unkind, but clear about expectations. She taught her children early that life required discipline, that resources must not be wasted, that family loyalty was among the highest virtues. These lessons would stay with Napoleone for the rest of his life, sometimes in ways that were helpful, sometimes in ways that complicated things considerably. Carlo Bonaparte, the father, was a warmer and more indulgent presence, charming, enthusiastic, full of plans and schemes for advancing the family's fortunes. He had political ambitions of his own, and he spent a good deal of time navigating the social and legal landscape of Corsica, making connections, seeking opportunities. He was not always home, and when he was away, Letizia held everything together with quiet efficiency. The island itself was a constant presence in those early years. The maquis on the hillsides above the town, that thick, sweet-smelling scrub land, was a place where the Bonaparte boys would wander on holidays, scrambling over rocks, disturbing lizards, collecting the small wildflowers that grew in the crevices. The smell of it would stay with Napoleone for his entire life. Later, when he was far from Corsica, he would say that he could recognize the smell of his home island with his eyes closed, that it carried something irreplaceable, something that no other place in the world possessed. The olive trees in the gardens around Ajaccio cast their particular silver-green shade. The figs grew heavy and dark in the late summer. The harbor water was sometimes green, sometimes blue, sometimes a pale turquoise in the shallow places near the shore. In winter, the mountains above the town occasionally received a light dusting of snow, which the people of Ajaccio would look up at with a mild and comfortable wonder, knowing that the snow was far away and would not trouble them much. This was the world into which Napoleon Bonaparte was born. Small, warm, fragrant, bounded by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. A world where everyone knew everyone, where family connections mattered enormously, where the wider world beyond the island was something that existed in stories and rumors more than in direct experience. But that wider world was already preparing to make itself known. When Napoleon was about 5 years old, he began attending school in Ajaccio. The schooling available in Corsica at that time was not especially sophisticated. The island was not a place of great universities or learned academies, but it was enough to begin building the foundations of a young mind. He learned to read, to write, to work with numbers. Even in these earliest lessons, there were signs of the particular qualities that would define him later. He had a strong memory. He could hold facts and figures in his mind with unusual ease. He was competitive, always wanting to know how he compared to the other children, always wanting to be best. And he had a particular attraction to mathematics, to the clean certainty of numbers, to the way in which a mathematical problem had a definite answer that could be reached through precise and logical steps. Language was more complicated for him. His first language, really, was not French, but a mixture of Corsican Italian, the dialect of his home island. French was something he had to learn as a foreign language, and he would struggle with it for years, never fully losing the accent and occasional grammatical irregularities that marked him as a man from elsewhere. This would sometimes be a source of mockery at his schools on the mainland, but it would also, perhaps, be a small part of what drove him to excel in other ways. Carlo Bonaparte had decided that his sons would have the best education that could be managed. This was not an easy decision financially, but it was one he was determined to pursue. In France, the crown had made available a number of scholarships for the sons of minor noble families, particularly from recently acquired territories like Corsica. Carlo worked hard to establish the family's claim to noble status, a process that required documentation and persistence, and eventually he succeeded. In the autumn of 1778, when Napoleone was 9 years old, Carlo Bonaparte made arrangements for his 2 eldest sons to travel to France for their education. Joseph would attend the seminary at Autun, studying for a possible career in the church. Napoleone had been granted a scholarship to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château, in the Champagne region of France. The journey from Ajaccio to Brienne was long and strange. First, there was the sea voyage to the French mainland, crossing that blue Mediterranean that Napoleone had always known as his horizon, moving away from it toward something entirely different. Then there was the overland journey through a France that must have seemed enormous and foreign to a 9-year-old boy from a small Corsican town. The flat plains of Champagne, so different from the rocky hills of his island. The vast gray sky, the cold, the different sounds and smells. Carlo accompanied his sons as far as Autun, where Joseph was settled into his new school. Then, after a few weeks, Carlo departed, and Napoleone was taken to Brienne. He arrived at the military school alone, a small, dark-eyed boy who spoke French with a heavy accent, who barely knew anyone, who had never been far from his family or his island before. He was 9 years old. Let us take a moment to rest here, to breathe quietly, to think about what that must have felt like, the particular mixture of bravery and loneliness that it takes to be a young child in a completely foreign place, surrounded by strangers, with no immediate way home. It is the kind of thing that either crushes a person or makes them stronger. Sometimes it does both at once. Part 2. The School at Brienne. The military school at Brienne-le-Château was a serious place. It had been established as one of a number of royal military schools across France, designed to train young men of minor noble families for careers as officers in the French army. The buildings were solid and gray, surrounded by the flat, somewhat austere landscape of Champagne, very different from the warm, fragrant hills of Corsica. The winters there were cold, genuinely cold, not the mild Corsican winters that Napoleon had known. Snow fell in earnest, lying thick on the ground for weeks at a time, and the wind that came across the open plains was sharp and unforgiving. The school operated on a rigorous schedule. The boys rose early, attended classes through the morning and afternoon, and were expected to maintain a certain standard of behavior and performance. There were studies in mathematics, history, geography, drawing, music, Latin, French, and of course the various subjects relevant to military life, fortification, surveying, and so on. The discipline was firm, but not harsh by the standards of the time. The food was adequate, the accommodations were modest. Napoleon's first months at Brienne were not easy. The other boys came from various parts of France, and many of them had grown up speaking standard French, with accents and manners that marked them as properly French, in a way that this small Corsican boy was not. He was mocked at times for his accent, for his unusual name, for the fact that he so clearly came from somewhere else. He had a proud and sensitive nature, and the mockery stung him, though he tried not to show it. He was not the kind of boy who would cry where others could see. He responded, characteristically, by working harder. He threw himself into his studies with an energy and focus that was remarkable, even among his serious-minded fellow students. Mathematics, especially, came to him with great ease. He seemed to understand numbers and spatial relationships almost instinctively, in a way that made his tutors take notice. He read extensively and retained what he read with unusual precision. His memory for facts was extraordinary, and he would add new information to his mental store and be able to retrieve it later with remarkable accuracy. But there were more immediate challenges to navigate than just the academic ones. Social life among schoolboys is its own complicated world, with its own hierarchies and rules. Napoleon was an outsider, in origin, in manner, in accent, and outsiders must find their own way to establish themselves. He was not particularly large or physically imposing for his age, but he was strong-willed, and when necessary, fierce. He did not back down from confrontations. He was not a bully, but he was not easily bullied either. One of the small stories that comes down to us from his time at Brienne involves snow. In the winter of one of his early years there, a significant snowfall covered the school grounds. The other boys began throwing snowballs in the somewhat random and chaotic way of schoolboys. Napoleon had a different idea. He organized a group of boys, through sheer force of personality and the clarity of his instructions, into two opposing teams, with actual defensive positions built from packed snow, and ran what was essentially a military operation. He directed his side with such energy and effectiveness that they won decisively. The other boys were impressed, and Napoleon's standing among them improved considerably. It was a small thing, but it pointed toward something real, a natural inclination toward organization, toward strategy, toward seeing a disordered situation and bringing structure to it. These qualities would define him his whole life. Over the years at Brienne, he settled in. He did not become universally popular. He was too intense, too serious, sometimes too prickly for that. But he earned respect, which mattered more to him anyway. He had a few close friendships, though even these tended to be of a somewhat serious nature. He was not a frivolous boy. He rarely participated in the lighter social activities of school life for their own sake. He was already, focused on something further ahead. He read voraciously. The school had a library, and Napoleon used it more than almost any other student. He was particularly drawn to history, not the dry recitation of dates and rulers that formal history lessons sometimes became, but the real texture of how events unfolded, how great men rose and fell, how armies moved across landscapes, how empires were built and then collapsed. He read about ancient Rome with deep attention. He read about Alexander the Great, about Julius Caesar, about the great conquerors and rulers of antiquity. And he read them not as distant legends, but as practical case studies in the exercise of power and ambition. He was also reading about Corsica and thinking about Corsica quite a lot. There was a period during his years at Brienne when his primary identification was not as a Frenchman, that still felt imposed, not quite real, but as a Corsican. He wrote essays, as a young teenager, in which he expressed strong feelings about Corsican identity and independence, about the history of his island and its particular character. He admired Paoli, the Corsican independence leader who had fought for the island's freedom before the French took over. He wrote about Paoli with something close to reverence. This is a small but important thing to notice. The boy who would one day become Emperor of France spent a significant portion of his early years thinking of himself as something other than French, writing with passion about Corsican identity and independence. He was in some sense a man of two worlds, or perhaps a man who was not fully of either world, and who had to construct his own world through sheer force of will. The years at Brienne passed in their slow, seasonal rhythm. The cold winters, the brief springs, the warm summers when the flat Champagne countryside turned green and the days were long. Napoleon studied, argued, competed, read, and grew. He was not always happy. He missed Corsica, missed his family, suffered through the particular loneliness of being far from home for long stretches without seeing the people who loved him. He wrote letters home, received letters in return, learned the particular skill of maintaining closeness across distance through words on paper. He grew, gradually, into a young man. The accent never fully disappeared. The intensity never softened. But he became more capable, more accomplished, more aware of the wider world and his potential place in it. In the autumn of 1784, when he was 15 years old, Napoleon was selected for transfer to the École Militaire in Paris, the prestigious Royal Military School in the French capital itself. This was a distinction, a sign that he had distinguished himself academically at Brienne. Not every student was recommended for Paris. Only the most promising were selected. And so he made the journey again, this time from Brienne to Paris, from the flat plain of Champagne to the great, teeming, magnificent city that was the capital of France, the center of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. Paris in 1784 was something extraordinary. If Ajaccio was a small, quiet harbor town, and Brienne was a serious and somewhat Spartan school in the provinces, Paris was something else entirely, an assault on the senses, a place of overwhelming scale and energy and complexity. The population of Paris at that time was somewhere around 600,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe, and it showed. The streets were full, the markets were loud, the buildings were tall and grand and pressed closely together, and everywhere there was the sense of something enormous moving, the machinery of a great civilization running at full speed. The École Militaire occupied a handsome building on the left bank of the Seine, near the Champ de Mars, the great open field that had been used for military exercises and would later become famous for other reasons. The school was considerably more prestigious and more comfortable than Brienne had been. The students here were a step further along in their training, older and more advanced, and the whole atmosphere was more refined, more aware of its own importance. Napoleon arrived there in October of 1784 and threw himself into his work with characteristic intensity. He was determined to complete the normal 2-year course in 1 year, and he largely succeeded. His mathematical abilities had continued to develop, and he excelled particularly in the practical military sciences, artillery, military geometry, fortification. Artillery especially fascinated him. The science of how cannonballs traveled through the air, the calculations required to aim a gun with accuracy at a distant target. This was the kind of problem that played perfectly to his mathematical mind. He would later, famously, be known as a man who understood artillery with unusual depth, who treated his guns as instruments of precision rather than just noise and destruction. During the single year he spent at the École Militaire, he also had his first real sustained contact with Paris as a city, with French culture as it existed at its most refined and concentrated level. He visited the theater, walked the streets, observed the sharp contrast between the wealth and refinement of the aristocracy and the grinding poverty of the city's lower classes. This contrast was impossible to miss in Paris in the 1780s. The city was beautiful in places, squalid in others, and the inequality between its inhabitants was brazen and uncomfortable. He also, during this period, received word from home that his father, Carlo Bonaparte, had fallen ill. This was distressing news. Carlo had been unwell for some time, suffering from what may have been stomach cancer, though the medicine of the time was imprecise in such diagnoses. He had traveled to Montpellier in the south of France seeking treatment, but the illness was progressing. Carlo Bonaparte died in February of 1785 at the age of 38. He was not an old man. He left behind Letizia and their 8 surviving children, a modest estate, and the question of how the family would manage. Napoleon was 15 when his father died. He received the news at school in Paris, far from home, unable to return in time to say goodbye. This was the particular cruelty of distance. In an era when travel was slow and communication was limited, death could happen and be over before the people who needed to know had even heard. The grief of this loss was real, and it left Napoleon as the eldest male Bonaparte in a practical sense, since his older brother Joseph had a gentler and less assertive nature. The weight of family responsibility began to settle on Napoleon's shoulders, and he felt it. He grieved in his private way, and then he continued with his work. There was nothing else to do. The examination for the artillery corps was approaching, and he needed to prepare for it. In September of 1785, Napoleon Bonaparte passed his examinations, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French Royal Artillery. He was 16 years old. He had completed his military training in record time, performing exceptionally well in all the technical subjects that mattered most. He was assigned to the La Fère Artillery Regiment, stationed in Valence, a town in the Rhône Valley in southeastern France. He packed his belongings, said whatever goodbyes needed to be said, and began his adult life. Part 3. The Young Officer. Valence is a pleasant town on the western bank of the Rhône, with the river broad and gray-green before it, and the hills of Ardèche rising beyond. In the autumn of 1785, it would have had a comfortable provincial character, not as grand as Paris certainly, but a real French town with its cafes and its market square, and its social life of a modest but genuine kind. Napoleon arrived as a 16-year-old second lieutenant, one of the most junior officers in his regiment. He was young for his rank, small in stature. He had not grown very tall, hovering somewhere around 5 feet 6 inches by most estimates, which was around average height for the time, despite the later legend that he was unusually short, and still marked by his Corsican accent and manner. He lived in modest quarters, as befitted his rank and salary, which was not generous. But he had arrived somewhere real at last. He was no longer a student. He was an officer in the French army with real responsibilities and a real place in the world. It was a beginning. Life as a junior officer in peacetime France had a considerable amount of empty time in it. The routines of regimental life, drilling, maintaining equipment, attending to the administrative duties of his position, occupied some hours, but not all of them. Napoleon used the remaining time the way he always had. He read. He read enormously, systematically, working through history and philosophy and literature and geography with the focus of a man determined to know as much as possible, about as much as possible. He kept detailed notes, filling small notebooks with summaries and reflections on what he read. He was teaching himself, in a sense, the curriculum that no formal school had quite managed to give him, a comprehensive understanding of the world and its workings. He also continued to think about Corsica and about his family. His mother was managing with admirable resilience, but there was never quite enough money, and Napoleon sent home what he could from his modest salary, which was not very much. He went back to Corsica when he could, on the various periods of leave that his service allowed. Those returns were complicated, sweet and difficult at once, full of the particular emotions that come from returning to a beloved place as a different person than the one who left. He was changing. The years of education, the time in Paris, the contact with the wider world, all of it was reshaping him slowly. His sense of Corsican identity remained strong, but it was beginning to coexist with something else, a growing awareness of himself as a participant in the larger drama of European history. He was reading about that history with intense engagement, and he was beginning to see, perhaps, that the larger stage was where the interesting things were happening. And the larger stage, in the late 1780s, was beginning to become very interesting indeed. France in 1787 and 1788 was a kingdom in deep trouble. The financial situation of the royal government was desperate. Years of expensive wars, including the American Revolution in which France had supported the colonists against Britain, had left the treasury strained to breaking. The harvests of 1788 had been poor, leading to bread shortages and rising prices that hit the poor of both city and countryside with terrible force. resentment of the nobility, and the privileges of the aristocracy had been building for years, fed by the ideas of the Enlightenment, the philosophical movement that had spent decades arguing for reason, for equality, for the natural rights of human beings, against the old inherited hierarchies of kings and lords. In the early months of 1789, the crisis came to a head. The king, Louis XVI, was a decent but ineffective man, caught between the demands of his empty treasury, the resistance of the nobility to any reform that would cost them money, and the growing fury of a population that was hungry and angry, and had been reading too many pamphlets about liberty and rights. In May of 1789, the Estates General met at Versailles, a great assembly of representatives from all three orders of French society, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. It was the first time this body had met in over a century and a half. The commoners' representatives, the Third Estate, quickly made clear that they had come with revolutionary intent. Within weeks they had declared themselves a national assembly and sworn to give France a proper constitution. The old order was cracking. On July 14, 1789, a mob in Paris stormed the Bastille prison, an act more symbolic than militarily significant, but enormously powerful as a symbol. The French Revolution had begun. Napoleon was 20 years old. He was in Valence when the revolution began, and he watched its early developments with fascination, and broadly with sympathy. The old regime, the aristocracy, the privileges of birth over merit, the rigid hierarchies that had complicated his own life from the beginning, was something he had little reason to love. He was not an aristocrat in any meaningful sense. He was a minor Corsican nobleman who had to fight for every position he had. The idea that merit should matter more than birth, that talent should be rewarded, this was an idea that spoke directly to his own situation. Over the following months and years, France transformed with terrifying speed. The revolution moved through phases, from hopeful constitutionalism to more radical republicanism to, eventually, the dark and violent period known as the Terror, when the revolutionary government executed not just aristocrats and the king himself, but anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary fervor. The revolution ate its own children, as revolutions have a tendency to do. Napoleon watched and thought. He continued to serve in the army, though the army itself was being transformed. The old officer corps, heavily aristocratic, was being replaced as nobles fled the country. New men, men of lower social origins but real ability, were rising. The path upward was suddenly, genuinely open in a way it had never been before. For a young man of talent and ambition from a modest Corsican family, the revolution was, in a strange way, an opportunity. He continued through these years to go back and forth between his regiment and Corsica. His Corsican period was coming to a complicated end. The island was itself caught up in revolutionary politics, and the old hero Paoli, whom Napoleon had admired so deeply in his youth, had returned from exile and was navigating the new political reality. The relationship between young Napoleon and Paoli was awkward. They were on different sides of various questions, and eventually things deteriorated badly. By the spring of 1793, the Bonaparte family situation in Corsica had become untenable. There was active hostility toward them from Paoli's faction, and in June of 1793, the family, Letizia, and as many of the Bonaparte children as were present, were effectively chased from their home. They fled to the French mainland as refugees, leaving behind most of what they owned. It was a rupture. The tie to Corsica, already complicated, was now broken in a deep way. Whatever had held Napoleone's identity rooted to that small, fragrant island, the break had come. He was now, fully and permanently, a man of France. Whatever he would become it here, on this larger stage. And the stage was extraordinarily turbulent. France was at war, with Austria, with Prussia, with Britain and other powers, who feared that the revolutionary example might spread to their own kingdoms. The army was fighting on multiple fronts. The revolution at home was entering some of its most violent phases. Everything was uncertain. Everything was in flux. And in that flux, for a talented young artillery officer of 23, there were suddenly extraordinary possibilities. The moment that changed everything came at the end of 1793, at a place called Toulon. Toulon was, and is, a great naval port on the Mediterranean coast of southern France, a city of real strategic importance. In the summer of 1793, Royalist forces within Toulon had handed the port over to a British fleet. This was an enormous problem for the French revolutionary government. Toulon was one of the most important ports in the country, and having it in British hands was intolerable. A French Republican army was dispatched to retake it. The siege of Toulon, as it would be known, lasted several months. Napoleon arrived there in September of 1793, initially replacing an artillery commander who had been wounded. He was 23 years old, a captain. He found a situation that was not going especially well. The Republican forces had been conducting their siege without much strategic clarity. Napoleon looked at the layout of the land and harbor, analyzed the situation with the trained eye of an artillery officer, and immediately identified something crucial. There was a promontory, Fort l'Aiguillette, that commanded the harbor entrance. If French artillery could be placed on that promontory, the British ships in the harbor would be unable to remain. Without being fired upon continuously, they would have to leave. And if the British fleet left, the Royalists in the town would be stranded without support and the city would fall. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. It was also, to someone with good spatial understanding and an eye for terrain, obvious, which perhaps explains why no one had already thought of it. Napoleon proposed it, argued for it, and eventually persuaded the senior commanders to try it. He worked tirelessly to gather artillery pieces, to position them, to direct the bombardment. He was not content to merely give orders from a safe distance. He was present at his guns, in the thick of things, moving among the men, checking the angles, calculating trajectories. He was wounded once, slightly, during the operation. Fort l'Aiguillette fell to the French in mid-December. Just as Napoleon had predicted, the British fleet promptly sailed out of Toulon harbor rather than face continuous artillery fire from the heights. The city fell to the Republican forces shortly after. Toulon was a turning point, not just for the campaign but for Napoleon's life. The men who mattered, the political representatives of the revolutionary government who were present at the siege, including one named Augustin Robespierre, brother to the more famous Maximilian, had seen this young officer work, and they were enormously impressed. Reports went back to Paris of the artillery captain who had seen what needed to be done and done it with skill and determination. The week after Toulon fell, Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. In an army and a country being remade from the ground up. In the world where old hierarchies had been swept away and merit, or the appearance of it, was the new currency, the path had opened. He was ready for it. Let us breathe here for a moment. Let the story settle gently around you, like a soft blanket being smoothed over a sleeping form. We have come in our quiet journey from a small house in Ajaccio, through the cold winters of Brienne, through the grand corridors of the École Militaire in Paris, through the confused and turbulent years of a young officer watching his world transform, to this moment of first real recognition. A young man of 24, recently promoted, standing somewhere in the south of France as the cold Mediterranean winter settled over the hills. It is remarkable, really, how much had already happened by this point, how much ground had been covered, geographically, socially, emotionally, by this single young man in 24 years of life. And yet, in another sense, as you will find as we continue our journey together, everything that had happened so far was only the preparation. The stage was only now being set. Outside the windows of wherever you are resting tonight, the world is quiet. The day has given way to night, as it always does. The same stars that hung over Corsica in 1769, the same stars that watched over Toulon in December of 1793, are up there somewhere above you now, patient and unchanged, as they always are. There is something comforting in that continuity, in the fact that the sky endures, that the same light falls on very different times and places, connecting them in some quiet, eternal way. Rest for a moment. Let the story be with you. And when you are ready, we will continue. Part 4. The Rising General. The year 1794 was a dramatic one in France. The Terror, the period of mass executions and revolutionary extremism, reached its peak, and then, in the summer, collapsed suddenly when Maximilien Robespierre himself was arrested and guillotined. The period known as Thermidorian reaction followed, a pulling back from the most extreme positions, a tentative move toward a more moderate republicanism. For Napoleon, the fall of Robespierre was briefly dangerous. He had been associated with the Robespierre brothers, had benefited from their patronage, and in the confused aftermath of Thermidor, he was briefly placed under arrest on suspicion of various political connections. The arrest was short-lived. There was not much solid against him, and he was released after a couple of weeks. But it was a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in revolutionary France. He spent much of 1794 and early 1795 in something of a professional limbo, trying to manage his career amid the political confusion. He was not the kind of man who accepted passivity easily. He submitted plans and proposals, lobbied for assignments, made himself useful where he could. He was sometimes frustrated, sometimes briefly despondent, always thinking, always planning. His personal life, too, was in motion. He had met a young woman in Valence years before, a woman named Caroline du Colombier, from a respectable local family, for whom he had felt a gentle affection. There were other connections, other brief friendships, and something more than friendships, as there are in any young man's life. But none of these early attachments would define his heart as much as the connection that was coming. For now, in 1795, Napoleon was finding his way through a changed and changing world. The army had a new command structure, new priorities, new political masters. The question was where a talented young general might best be employed. The answer came in October of 1795 on the streets of Paris. In the autumn of 1795, the French government, operating under what was called the Directory, a group of 5 men who collectively held executive power, faced a serious internal threat. Royalist forces in Paris, supported by conservative sections of the population, were planning an armed insurrection, an attempt to overturn the revolutionary government by force. Sections of the National Guard, sympathetic to the Royalists, were mobilizing. The commander of the Paris garrison needed someone he could trust to organize the defense of the convention, the revolutionary parliament. He called on Napoleon, who was then in Paris and available. What followed on the 13th of Vendémiaire, the 5th of October in the regular calendar, was swift and decisive. Royalist forces advanced on the convention building. Napoleon had positioned his artillery carefully throughout the surrounding streets, and when the moment came, he ordered the guns to fire. The effect was immediate and definitive. The artillery, and the phrase that would become famous was, "a whiff of grape shot," scattered the insurrectionists and ended the uprising in a matter of minutes. The Directory was saved, the convention was protected, and Napoleon was once again the man of the hour. The Directory was grateful. Within weeks they gave him the command he had been hoping for, command of the Army of Italy. The Army of Italy was not, at that moment, the most prestigious or well-supplied force in the French military. It had been operating in the mountainous terrain between France and Italy, engaging Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a campaign that had been, for some time, inconclusive. The army was underfed, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Previous commanders had not distinguished themselves. Napoleon was 26 years old when he took command in March of 1796. He arrived to find an army in rough shape, but an army, a real fighting force, with professional soldiers who had been in the mountains long enough to know them well, who were tough and experienced, even if they were also hungry and tired. His first act was to speak to his officers, and then to his soldiers. He told them what they were going to do. They were going to march out of these mountains into the plains of Italy, and there they would find food and shelter, and the resources that France could not currently provide them. He told them this with absolute conviction, with the particular kind of certainty that communicates itself and becomes, somehow, contagious. The men who heard him speak began, despite themselves, to believe it. And then they moved. The campaign that followed was remarkable for its speed. Napoleon drove his army at a pace that consistently caught the opposing forces, the Austrians, the Piedmontese, before they could prepare. He had studied the terrain extensively, knew where the passes were, knew where an army could move quickly and where it would be slowed. He moved along the ridges between two opposing armies, hit one before the other could reinforce it, then turned and hit the other. The strategy was fluid, aggressive, always seeking the decisive engagement before the enemy could consolidate. Victory followed victory through the spring of 1796. Piedmont sued for an armistice within weeks. The Austrian army was pushed back repeatedly. French forces swept through Lombardy, through cities that had not seen a conqueror in many years. Napoleon managed the civilian populations with a certain shrewdness. There was looting, inevitably, But he tried to limit the worst of it, aware that an army that behaved too badly created enemies faster than it could defeat them. He presented himself, where possible, as a liberator from Austrian control, rather than a conqueror in his own right. By autumn, he had pushed deep into Austrian territory, and the Austrians were beginning to negotiate. The Treaty of Campel Formio, signed in October of 1797, ended the War of the First Coalition on terms enormously favorable to France and to Napoleone. He had transformed the Italian campaign from a stalemate into a sweeping French success. He was 27 years old, and he was the most celebrated military man in France. Let us pause here in the late autumn of 1797 and try to sense what that must have felt like. Not the excitement of victory, which we can perhaps imagine, but the deeper quality of the moment. Napoleone had traveled, in just a few years, from obscurity to fame, from a junior position to command, from being a Corsican outsider struggling with his French accent, to being the most talked about man in the Republic. The newspapers wrote about him constantly. His dispatches from Italy, written by himself, always with an eye on how they would be read, had created an image of heroism and brilliance that captured the public imagination. He came back to Paris in December of 1797 to a hero's welcome. The city adored him. The Directory was more ambivalent. Powerful, popular generals are always slightly dangerous to the politicians who nominally command them. But they celebrated him publicly, while quietly wondering what to do with him. There was also now a personal matter of significance. Before leaving for Italy, in the weeks just prior to the campaign, Napoleone had fallen deeply, quickly, and somewhat dizzyingly in love. The woman was Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of 32, older than Napoleone by 6 years, with 2 children from her first marriage. She was from a French aristocratic family, originally from the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, and she had survived the terror by the narrowest of margins. Her first husband had been guillotined, and she herself had spent time in prison before being released when Robespierre fell. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense of the time, but she was deeply attractive in a way that many people found irresistible. Graceful, warm, sophisticated, with a voice that was noted by everyone who heard it as particularly charming, low and melodic. She moved in the elevated social circles of Paris, knew everyone, had the ease of manner that comes from being comfortable in the world. Napoleone was captivated. He wrote her letters from Italy that are remarkable for their intensity. Passionate, almost frantic letters, full of longing and devotion and the particular urgency of a man who has fallen helplessly in love. They had married quickly, just before the Italian campaign, in March of 1796. The marriage had been a civil ceremony, simple and brief, fitting into the rushed days before his departure. The love affair between Napoleone and Josephine was one of the great emotional stories of his life, complicated, painful at times, but real. He loved her, quite genuinely and completely, in a way that surprised even him. She was less entirely swept away. She was fond of him, perhaps more than fond, but she was also a woman of the world who had learned to be careful about emotional investments. She was not entirely faithful to him during the long months of the Italian campaign, and when Napoleone found out, as he did, it caused him tremendous pain. But he could not stop loving her, and they remained together. It is one of the more human and touching aspects of this larger-than-life story. the great general, the man of steel nerves and relentless energy, undone to a considerable degree by his feelings for this particular woman. Part 5. Egypt and the Return. After the triumph of the Italian campaign and the Treaty of Campo Formio, the Directory looked around for something to do with their brilliant, restless, popular general. France and Britain were still technically at war, and various schemes were being discussed for how to deal with Britain, the most difficult of France's enemies, protected by its island geography and its powerful navy. A direct invasion of Britain was proposed, and then more or less ruled out as impractical. The alternative that emerged was something more exotic, an expedition to Egypt. The idea behind the Egyptian expedition was strategic, at least in theory. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, but functionally controlled by a military caste called the Mamelukes. If France could establish a presence in Egypt, the logic went, it could threaten Britain's route to India, a route of enormous importance to British commerce and empire. It was also, conveniently, an expedition that would take Napoleon far from Paris, which suited the Directory just fine. Napoleon himself was attracted to the idea for reasons that went beyond pure strategy. He had been reading about Alexander the Great for years, had been fascinated by the story of that Macedonian conqueror who had swept across the ancient world all the way to India. There was something in the Egyptian idea, the ancient land, the pyramids, the scale of the undertaking, that appealed to the part of him that loved grand gestures and historical resonance. He was 28 years old, supremely confident, and Egypt offered the possibility of being not just a general, but something approaching what the ancient world had known, a conqueror hero in the classical mode. He assembled not just an army, but a commission of scholars, scientists, artists, linguists, engineers, 250 of them, roughly. They would study Egypt as the army occupied it. This was a genuinely unusual element of the expedition, and one that would have lasting consequence, because it was this group of scholars who would later produce the Description de l'Égypte, a monumental multi-volume work that effectively founded the modern discipline of Egyptology. The fleet sailed from Toulon in May of 1798. The crossing of the Mediterranean was tense. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson was out there somewhere with a fleet looking for them. But the French managed to avoid him, stopping briefly to seize Malta on the way. They arrived off the coast of Egypt in early July. Egypt itself was a revelation. The heat was extraordinary, nothing like the Mediterranean warmth that Napoleon had grown up with, nothing like anything he had experienced in France or Italy. It was a dry, ferocious heat, pressing down from a white sky that looked bleached of color. The Nile Delta was flat and green, but behind it, stretching away in all directions, was the desert, that vast, amber, inhuman landscape that had a beauty of its own, an austere and almost spiritual quality. Napoleon looked at the pyramids of Giza for the first time, and was reportedly struck into silence. The pyramids were already, even then, old beyond comprehension. They had been standing for more than 4,000 years before this French general came to look at them. Whatever Napoleon said to his soldiers before the battle that would be fought near them, there is a famous quote about 40 centuries looking down upon them from the height of the pyramids. Though scholars debate whether he said it exactly as reported, the sentiment was real enough. There was something about standing before those ancient structures that made even a man of Napoleon's ego feel the smallness of human lives against the scale of time. The military campaign in Egypt went well enough initially. The Mameluke cavalry was defeated at the Battle of the Pyramids in late July. Cairo was taken. Napoleon established a French administration, tried to govern with a certain respect for local customs and religion, presented himself as a liberator from Mameluke tyranny rather than a conqueror. But things began to go wrong quite quickly. In August of 1798, the British fleet under Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and attacked it in a night battle that became one of the most decisive naval engagements of the era. The French ships were destroyed. Not all of them, but most of them, including the flagship. The French army in Egypt was suddenly cut off from France. Without the naval support, it needed to be resupplied or reinforced. They were stranded in a foreign land, in intense heat, with disease beginning to take a toll. Napoleon responded with characteristic energy, pushing the campaign onward, marching north through the Sinai toward Palestine, moving as though the situation were not desperate, as though force of will could overcome the fundamental problem that they were cut off from home. But the campaign stalled eventually. Disease, plague, dysentery, heat exhaustion killed far more men than the enemy. The siege of Acre on the Palestinian coast failed. The army turned back toward Egypt. And then in August of 1799, Napoleon made the decision to leave. He received news from France. News suggesting that the political situation at home had deteriorated badly, that the Directory was weak and unpopular, that France needed leadership. He left his army in Egypt in the care of General Kléber, took a small group of aides, and slipped away on a ship, moving quickly and secretively to avoid the British naval patrols. The departure has been criticized. He was leaving his army stranded. But it has also been understood as the decision of a man who recognized that the larger opportunity lay back in France, and that there was nothing more to be gained in Egypt. Whether or not it was the right choice, morally or strategically, it was the decisive choice. He was going home. He arrived in France in October of 1799. He had been away for over a year. In that year, France had been transformed again. The Directory was failing. The wars were going badly. The public was exhausted and desperate for something different. The time was right for a change. Part 6. The Coup and the Consul. Napoleon arrived back in Paris to discover that he was still, despite everything, enormously popular. The news from Egypt had been carefully managed. The victories had been reported, the disasters and retreats less so. The public's image of him was still of the great hero, the undefeated general who had even gone to Egypt, that ancient and romantic land. Whatever the reality of what had happened there, the story, as it had been received in France, was still a story of glory. The Directory, meanwhile, was nearly universally despised. It had governed for 4 years in a state of constant political crisis, purging its opponents, manipulating elections, lurching from one emergency to the next. It had no political legitimacy to speak of, no public trust. It was held together by inertia more than anything else. Various people in Paris had been thinking about what should replace it, and various schemes were in motion. Among those thinking most urgently were 2 former directors, Sieyès and Roger Ducos, who had their own ideas about constitutional reform, but lacked the kind of popular support that could give a new government stability. They needed a general. They needed someone with a public profile and military authority who could provide the necessary force. Not violence necessarily, but the credible presence of force that a successful coup would require. They approached Napoleon. He was interested. And so in November of 1799, the 18th and 19th of Brumaire in the French Revolutionary calendar, the coup was executed. It did not go entirely smoothly. Napoleon had to address the legislative chambers at Saint-Cloud, outside Paris, and the address itself went badly. He was nervous. His words came out confused. One chamber nearly turned on him physically and had to be cleared by soldiers under his brother Lucien's command. But in the end, by the evening of the 19th, it was done. The Directory was dissolved. A provisional governing body of 3 consuls, C.S., Roger Ducos, and Napoleon, was established.
Within weeks, through negotiation and the application of that particular kind of relentless pressure that Napoleon excelled at, the 3 consuls had been reduced to 1 in practical terms. A new constitution was written that gave the first consul, which is what Napoleon would be called, very nearly absolute executive power. It was put to a popular vote and approved by an enormous majority. France had been a republic, then a constitutional monarchy, then a republic again, and now it was becoming something harder to categorize. Nominally a republic, but with a single dominant executive who was, for all practical purposes, in charge of everything. Napoleon was 30 years old. He was first consul of France. The year was 1800. The period of the consulate, roughly 1800 to 1804, was one of the most genuinely productive and significant periods of Napoleon's career, though it is sometimes overshadowed in popular memory by the more dramatic events that followed. France was exhausted by 10 years of revolutionary upheaval. The country needed stability, practical governance, the reconstruction of institutions that had been torn down in the fever of revolution without entirely adequate replacements being built. Napoleon understood this, and he threw himself into the work of administration with the same energy and focus he brought to military campaigns. He reorganized the French legal system, creating what would become the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive set of civil laws that replaced the patchwork of regional customs and revolutionary legislation that had governed France imperfectly. The code established clear principles about property rights, contracts, inheritance, and the relationship between citizens and the state. It was a landmark achievement, and its influence spread far beyond France. Versions of the Napoleonic Code became the basis of legal systems across Europe, in Latin America, in parts of North America. It remains, in modified form, the basis of civil law in Louisiana and Quebec, among other places. He reorganized the national finances, creating the Banque de France to provide a stable financial infrastructure. He reorganized the educational system, creating the lycée, a network of secondary schools that would provide France with a supply of educated professionals and administrators. He reorganized the relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church, which had been one of the most damaging ruptures of the Revolution, through the Concordat of 1801, signed with Pope Pius VII. He restored the official status of the Church in France, while maintaining state control over key aspects of religious life. He worked extremely long hours, rising early, going to bed late, dealing with correspondence and meetings and decisions with the efficiency of a man for whom time was always precious and never quite sufficient. He had a remarkable ability to process information quickly, to move from one subject to the next without loss of focus, to hold multiple complex situations in his mind simultaneously. He also won another significant military campaign in the early months of 1800. The Austrians had taken advantage of the chaos of the coup period to move back into northern Italy, undoing much of what the Italian campaign of 1796 to 97 had accomplished. Napoleon led an army across the Alps, through the Great St. Bernard Pass in May of 1800, a logistically remarkable feat, and then engaged the Austrian forces at the Battle of Marengo in June. The battle was nearly lost at several points during the day, and was only turned into a French victory by a desperate counterattack in the late afternoon. But it was a victory, and it was enough. The Austrians made peace again. Let the story flow around you, quietly, as the night deepens. We are halfway through the first decade of the 19th century now, and the world we are visiting is taking on a different quality from the turbulent revolutionary years of the 1790s. There is still great drama ahead. There always is in a long life. But there are also moments of achievement, of building, of a kind of creative energy that deserves to be appreciated in its own right. In the quiet of this night, as your body settles into its rest and your breathing grows slower and more even, let us continue our gentle walk through this life. We are not rushing anywhere. There is no destination we must reach by a particular time. We are simply following, step by slow step, the thread of a remarkable story through the landscape of history. Part 7. The Emperor. The step from first consul to emperor was not, perhaps, as large as it might appear from the outside. In terms of actual power, Napoleon already had very nearly everything an emperor might have. But titles matter, to the man who holds them, to the people who acknowledge them, to the surrounding world that must decide how to respond. And in 1804, the question of making the change formal was very much in the air. France had been through so much. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy, executed the king, tried and failed to establish various republican forms of government, endured the terror, survived the Directory. And now, somehow, after all that upheaval, after all the blood and turmoil and grand declarations about liberty and equality, the country was being led by a single very powerful man who was growing more powerful all the time. The logic that had been building for several years now pointed toward a conclusion. If this was going to be, in practical terms, a hereditary dictatorship, and that is what it was becoming, then it might as well be acknowledged formally and given a proper constitutional structure. There were also practical arguments about the security of the succession. If Napoleon was emperor rather than merely first consul, then the question of who would follow him could be settled in advance, preventing the kind of political chaos that might follow his death or incapacitation. And so the process began. The Senate voted to offer Napoleon the imperial title. A new constitution was drafted. The question was put to a popular referendum and approved by an overwhelming majority. Though historians have noted that the referendum process was not entirely free of official pressure. The coronation was planned for December 2nd, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. Pope Pius VII himself was invited, indeed persuaded, to attend and bless the ceremony. This was significant. Having the Pope present gave the coronation a religious legitimacy that connected it to the great coronations of European history, including the coronation of Charlemagne 1,000 years before. Notre-Dame de Paris, in December of 1804, would have been transformed for the occasion. The medieval Gothic cathedral was draped in tapestries and decorations, temporarily remodeled to create the ceremonial space required. Thousands of candles burned, filling the vast interior with a warm, shifting light. The air would have smelled of incense and candle wax, and the cold of the December day outside. Dignitaries and guests filled every available space. The great and the powerful of France, military officers, civilian officials, members of what was becoming a new court aristocracy, were present in their finest clothes, their decorations glittering in the candlelight. The Pope was there, old and somewhat weary from the long journey from Rome, but present, because Napoleon had made clear that he expected him to be. There is the famous story of what happened at the moment of coronation.
Tradition would have had the Pope place the crown on Napoleon's head, as popes had crowned emperors in the great moments of European history. But Napoleon, at the last moment, took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head himself. Then he took Josephine's crown and placed it on her head, making her empress. The gesture has been interpreted in many ways. It was deliberate. Nothing in this ceremony was accidental. By crowning himself, Napoleon was saying something specific, that his power did not flow from the Church, from God's representative on earth, but from himself, from his own achievement, from the will of the French people as expressed in their votes. He was making a statement about the nature of authority in the modern world, a world being remade by the Revolution's insistence that sovereignty resided not in divine right, but in the nation. The Pope sat and watched. There was, reportedly, nothing he could do about it at that point except accept what had happened. The ceremony concluded. Napoleon was Emperor of the French. Josephine was Empress. The crowd outside Notre-Dame cheered in the cold December air, their breath making little clouds of steam in the winter cold. Church bells rang across Paris. Somewhere, in some small house in Ajaccio that would have been hard-pressed even to imagine this scene, Letizia Bonaparte, now officially styled as Madame Mère, the mother of an emperor, had given birth to a child who would stand in a cathedral and crown himself. The world has few stranger journeys to offer than this one. The years immediately following the coronation were, in many ways, the most magnificent of Napoleon's reign. He was emperor, he had secured his position at home, and he was about to demonstrate to the wider world exactly what that meant. For the wider world was not simply accepting the situation. Britain had never made peace with France during the entire period of the Revolution and the Consulate. There had been a brief armistice, called the Peace of Amiens, that had lasted from 1802 to 1803, but it had broken down, and Britain and France were at war again. Austria and Russia, alarmed by the growth of French power across Europe, had joined Britain in what was called the Third Coalition, an alliance designed to check and, if possible, reverse the expansion of French influence. In the summer of 1805, Napoleon was preparing for the possibility of invading Britain. A great army, the Grande Armée, as it was called, had been assembled and trained at a camp near Boulogne on the Channel coast, the closest point of France to the British shore. It was a formidable force by any measure, well-equipped, well-organized, full of experienced soldiers who had been training together for over a year. led by capable officers who had themselves been shaped by years of revolutionary warfare. The plan to cross the Channel depended on achieving at least temporary naval superiority, and this proved impossible. The French and Spanish fleets were not strong enough to contest the Channel against the British Navy, as would be definitively demonstrated at Trafalgar in October of 1805, when Nelson's fleet destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet in a battle off the coast of Spain. After Trafalgar, any serious possibility of invading Britain was essentially finished. But by the time Trafalgar happened, Napoleon had already turned his attention away from Britain and toward the continent. Austria and Russia had begun mobilizing, and the threat from the east was more immediately pressing. In late August of 1805, he made the decision to march the Grande Armée south and east, away from the Channel, into Germany. The marches that followed were a masterpiece of logistics and speed. The Grande Armée moved across France and into Germany in a matter of weeks, at a pace that the Austrians, whose strategic thinking assumed a slower and more traditional pace of operations, had not anticipated. They found themselves outmaneuvered before they had properly assembled. The Austrian army of General Mack was surrounded and trapped at Ulm in October of 1805, without a major battle even being necessary. Nearly 30,000 Austrian soldiers surrendered, a humiliation and a significant blow to the Allied cause. Napoleon pushed on eastward. Vienna, the Austrian capital, fell to French forces in November, the first time in living memory that a foreign army had occupied the city. The Austrian emperor had fled, but the war was not over, because the Russian army was still in the field, and a combined Austro-Russian force was gathering in Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, near a small town called Austerlitz. Part 8. Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after Napoleon's coronation as emperor, is generally considered one of the most brilliantly executed military operations in history. It is a battle that has been studied in military academies for 2 centuries, and its lessons about the use of terrain, the timing of movement, and the exploitation of an enemy's errors have not lost their relevance. But tonight we are not going to dwell on the violence or the drama of the fighting itself. Tonight, let us approach Austerlitz the way we might approach any remarkable human event, with attention to its quieter dimensions, its human context, the texture of the days and nights that surrounded it. The landscape of Moravia in early December was cold. The fields and hills around Austerlitz were dusted with frost, and in the mornings a thin mist lay over the low ground. The sky was the particular gray of Central European winter, low and flat, pressing down on the earth. It was not a comfortable time or place to be an army. The French forces had been marching and fighting for months by this point. They were tired, genuinely physically tired, but they were also confident, even exhilarated, in the particular way that a well-led army in a successful campaign can be. They trusted their commander. They had seen him be right again and again in ways that no one else had quite managed. That trust was an enormous military asset. The Allied army, Austrian and Russian forces together, was larger than the French force that faced them. They knew this, and they were planning to use the numerical advantage to attack Napoleon's right flank, sweeping around it and cutting off the French retreat. It was a reasonable plan, based on what appeared to be the tactical situation. Napoleon had spent days studying the terrain, observing the Allied positions, thinking through what they were likely to do. He had formed a very specific theory about their likely plan of attack, and he had designed his own dispositions to exploit it. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable, even more vulnerable than it actually was, to encourage the Allied commanders to commit to attacking it. The night before the battle, he rode through the French camp. He had done something he rarely did. He walked on foot among his soldiers, stopping to talk to men around their campfires, listening, joking, sharing the night with them. Word spread quickly through the camp that he was there, and something remarkable happened. The men began lighting torches made of straw, improvising little fires and lights to illuminate his passage. In a few minutes, the entire camp was lit up, a spectacle of light stretching across the dark December plain, with men cheering and the sound of voices carrying across the cold air. It was the night that became known in French history as the Sun of Austerlitz, though the sun would not rise until morning.
Napoleon himself was apparently genuinely moved by this spontaneous demonstration. He later said it was one of the finest moments he had known.